The following documentary provides highlights from a Civil War exhibit the Johnston County Heritage Center unveiled in March of 2015 in commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Bentonville. Many of the artifacts were borrowed from other museums, collectors, and family members of local Confederate veterans. It's our sincere hope that this exhibit, entitled American versus American, Our Most Cruel War, has been a meaningful learning tool for students, Civil War buffs, and others who yearn to know more about Johnston County's unique story. Politicians from the agrarian slaveholding South reached an impasse with those of the industrialized abolitionist North by 1850 over the expansion of slavery. Compromise delayed armed conflict for another decade, but the election of avowed abolitionist Abraham Lincoln as U.S. President in November of 1860 led to several Southern states seceding from the Union and forming the Confederate States of America. While Johnston and Wake were considered Democratic counties, their leaders voted with Republican pro-Union counties to keep North Carolina in the United States. After Lincoln asked North Carolina Governor John W. Ellis for troops to fight the South in the spring of 1861, the die was cast. A secession convention was held in May. Delegates Claudius Brock Sanders and William A. Smith from Johnston, along with those from Wake and 22 other counties, supported a resolution by former U.S. Senator George Badger of Raleigh not to secede, but to separate based on the constitutional right of revolution. On May 20th, 1861, at 5:30 p.m., a handkerchief was dropped from the west balcony of the state capitol, signifying that Sanders, Smith, and the others were outvoted and that secession had passed. A Wake militia unit that included Henry E. Thane and 7 other Johnstonians performed a 100-gun salute, and North Carolina was pulled into America's most cruel war. As troops mobilized for the impending conflict, there was a lot of activity throughout Johnston County and the rest of the South. Laura Elizabeth Lee Battle of Clayton recalled what it was like during this time.
From morning till night was heard fife and drum, or the talk of the citizens that preparations were being made all over the South for a contest which would soon end in favor of states' rights. Shortly, trains loaded with men going to enlist and soldiers kept the young people running to the depot to see the different regiments. Everyone had a flag, which was waved as the trains passed our town. Sometimes they made no stop at the stations, but the girls had notes of encouragement written and placed between the split sticks. And as the cars went by, the girls would throw their missives of faith and hope to these strangers. When the ladies were sewing on the uniforms, the girls would write notes and put them in the pockets of the soldiers' jackets. In these, they would write and beg the wearer to be true to his colors and his country, and never despair until the last Yankee had been whipped. Like bread cast upon the waters, the soldier boys read and were inspired with courage to go on. And very many correspondences begun like that, ripened in later years into love and marriage.
William Nicholas Rose Jr. recalls the day he enlisted in his village at Bentonville, North Carolina, and the irony of war.
The war came. When North Carolina made the first call for troops, I, in common with the other young men of the country, on the first day of May 1861, donned the red shirt of a soldier under Captain Barney Lane at the historic village of Bentonville in the county. Little did we think on this ever memorable first day of May that the closing scenes of the great struggle that was to follow would be upon the threshold of our once happy home, and at the very place where we first became a soldier.
Johnston County had no general or even a colonel to boast. Major Henry J. Riles of the 50th North Carolina Infantry Regiment was the county's highest-ranking officer. There were volunteers who believed in the lost cause of states' rights and fought bravely. There were conscripts who served only because the law said they must. And there were deserters whose primary allegiance was to home and family. Around 1,600 men left Johnston County to fight for the Confederacy. Over 450 did not return. Many came home unable to speak above a whisper for months, wounded, missing limbs, having nightmares, and carrying bullets or artillery fragments inside their heads and torsos. The exhibit includes a number of items these men brought back home, such as this tin cup used by Private William Gaston Lassiter, which was in his haversack at the funeral of Stonewall Jackson. Private Ransom Penny of the 5th North Carolina Regiment, Company C, came home on furlough to marry Henrietta Adams in July of 1864. That October, he was wounded in the temple at Cedar Creek, Virginia. He carried the minie ball in his head until he died over 50 years later. James Henry Duncan, with the 50th North Carolina Regiment, Company D, near Petersburg, Virginia, wrote a letter to his cousin, Private George W. Barber, describing those difficult conditions.
The bum shells and grape shot and minnie balls fell around us as thick as hell. There was so much dust and smoke we could not see one another. That was the hottest time I ever saw. We had to lie out 2 weeks in the rain just like hogs, and what little time we got to sleep, we just lay down and slept in a mud hole or in a frog pond or anywhere we could. We have been faring very well since we got to our tents.
Moses Stansel of the Confederate Navy was on board the ironclad CSS Albemarle when it was torpedoed on the Roanoke River in eastern North Carolina in October of 1864. Though badly wounded, he managed to escape through the large hole made in the ship's hull after it sank, and he swam to safety by clutching aboard. Private Henry E. Thane of Smithfield, member of the 1st North Carolina Artillery, won a name for himself during the Battle of Gettysburg. During the cannonading on the third day, he seized a shell, the fuse of which had become accidentally ignited, and ran with it several yards, meanwhile pulling out the fuse, thereby preventing an explosion and loss of life due to the battery. Union officers noted the grandeur of plantation houses, such as the plantation home of William A. Smith off Brogden Road, then known as River Road, and some decided they should not be left standing. Fortunately, this home was left standing. However, Thomas Atkinson's stately home, also on the River Road, and built for his bride Patty Richardson in 1859, was burned to the ground. After watching the family's imported furnishings smashed, Tom Atkinson asked that his orphan niece Mary Elizabeth's prized Steve piano be spared. In response, soldiers carried it outside, set it under a tree, and hacked it to pieces. Union soldiers made 4 attempts to burn the house, and each time Atkinson and his slaves put out the fire. A Union officer came on the scene and insisted, "No damned rebel shall be left with such a home," and the Atkinsons watched as it was finally engulfed in flames. The Agrippa Michener mansion would have met the same fate if a Union officer had not paid a visit to Michener's young widow, Fanny Secor Michener, and recognized her as a childhood acquaintance from New York. She came to Johnston County as a tutor for the Michener children only a few years earlier and married her employer. It was described as one of the grandest houses ever built in this part of North Carolina. 2 local regiments of state militia in eastern and western Johnston were responsible for keeping order at home and protecting soldiers' wives, children, and elderly family members. The Home Guard was a haven for Johnston's numerous pro-Union men who preferred not to fight for the Confederacy, and for planters who did not want to give up management of their plantations and slaves. Desertions were fairly common among Johnston soldiers serving in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Some came home to help plant or harvest crops and eventually returned to their regiments. To avoid being apprehended by the Home Guard or by regimental commanders on furlough, they hid deep in the woods and often slept in a hollowed-out log, such as this one. Women prepared meals and paid visits to their husbands before dawn to elude authorities. Nathan Tart of southern Johnston County was one soldier who received no mercy when he came home without leave to get in a crop for his young wife and small children. A descendant recalls hearing that Tart was plowing in the field on his farm near Benson when militia officers came up and shot him in the head without warning. They were told to make an example of this young father to discourage other would-be deserters who some believed were jeopardizing the Confederacy's chances of winning the war. Smithfield planter and merchant Seth Woodall, County Clerk of Court Thomas D. Sneed, and Militia Commissary Officer William H. Avera helped to organize a Johnston County Supply Association in October of 1863 to deal with a growing wartime food shortage. It came in part because of the Confederate government's practice of taking or impressing horses, livestock, and provisions for the war effort. The wives and aging parents of non-slaveholding soldiers were particularly vulnerable, since they already struggled to make enough of a crop to survive. According to the Raleigh Standard Weekly on October 28, 1863, the stated object of the association was to supply the indigent families of soldiers and others with the prime necessaries of life at cost, and in cases of entire penury and suffering, free of charge, provided such persons have made an effort to live through their own means and industry. At first, the war was financed by tariffs on imports and taxes on exports, a self-imposed embargo designed to raise European demand for cotton, and a U.S. Navy blockade of Wilmington and other southern ports led the Confederacy to print money, issue bonds, and impose taxes. The printing of currency did not keep pace with gold reserves, and inflation soon made the Confederate dollar worth very little. An unpopular but effective tax in kind was passed in 1863, requiring a tenth of agricultural products. Sheriff W.H. Cullum and his district tax collectors were kept quite busy. The Raleigh Weekly Standard published the Confederate monthly pay schedule for officers and enlisted men on August 14, 1861. It showed the highest paid were colonels at $195 a month, and the lowest was a private at $11 a month. Before the Civil War, infantry soldiers typically carried muskets that held just one bullet at a time. The effective range of these muskets was only about 80 yards, which meant battles were fought at close range. Rifled muskets, which could shoot up to 1,000 yards, were not used in the military because they took too long to load. That is, until Claude Mignet of France invented a cone-shaped lead bullet with a diameter smaller than that of the rifle barrel. Soldiers, who called them mini-balls, could load them quickly without the aid of ramrods or mallets. Rifles with these new bullets were more accurate and deadlier than muskets. Infantrymen had to change the way they fought. Even troops who were far from the line of fire had to protect themselves by building elaborate trenches and other fortifications. It's estimated that mini-balls accounted for 90% of casualties in the Civil War. By 1863, Union soldiers had access to repeating rifles, which fire more than one bullet without needing to reload. Southern states didn't have the industrial capability to make them, so during the last half of the war, Confederates were at a decided disadvantage. Bayonets attached to the end of the rifle, as well as pistols, knives, swords, and sabers, were used in close combat. Swords and sabers were carried by men in the cavalry and artillery and by officers in the infantry. African Americans also participated in the war effort. At least one African American from Johnston County, Nita Marp, served in the U.S. colored troops. But wealthy planters and their sons also had male slaves to wait on them in the Army. Bob Dillard was one such body servant from another part of the state. A.G. Powell chose a slave named Wright to follow his teenage son Charlie, a boyishly handsome soldier who started as a foot soldier and later transferred to the artillery. Charlie recalled his servant's loyalty and talents as a forager.
Many warm meals were sent me from the rear by him while I was on the firing line. He was of a pleasing address and carried in his breast pocket a daguerreotype of his young master, as he called me, which he showed to the young ladies while on his foraging expeditions. He usually came to the camp loaded to the limit, and most of it was contributed. He was furnished with sufficient money, but worked diplomacy. Much milk, butter, eggs, chickens, loaf bread, and hog killings, and even preserves. Dried fruit and honey came his way. Also invitations to dine at private homes, though I was too modest and bashful to accept.
Former slave Caroline Richardson lived and worked at the Ransom Bridgers farm on what is now Glen Road at the I-40-NC-42 intersection. She related a conversation she'd had with a person from the North.
One of the Yankees found me and asked me how many pairs of shoes I gets a year. I tell him that I gets one pair. Then he asked me what I wear in the summertime. When I tell him that I ain't wearing nothing but a shirt and that I goes barefooted in the summer, he cusses awful and he damns my masters. Mammy said that they told her and Papa that they'd get some land and a mule if they were free. You see, they tried to turn the slaves against their masters.
Parker Poole was a former slave in Clayton Township with this observation.
I saw the Confederates, General Johnson, come through Clayton, and the Yankees come through the second day after they come through. I think I seen enough Yankees come through there to whoop anything on God's earth. When they told me I was free, I didn't notice it. I stayed on and worked just like I've been doing, right on with Mrs. and Master. I stayed there a year after the surrender.
Philadelphia's Christian Recorder reported on May 27, 1865, that as Reverend Henry McNeil Turner, chaplain of the 1st Regiment in the U.S. Colored Troops, rode into Smithfield earlier that month, he encountered a slave woman whose child had been taken from her and hidden. As one of General William T. Sherman's staff questioned the woman's belligerent mistress on the piazza, Turner offered a proposition.
It is reported that the child is hid in town, but she says her husband has taken it into the country. I now propose, as he has 5 children standing here, that we take one to be held as hostage until the colored child is returned to its mother. The words had barely left my mouth before such running, crying, and squealing took place among the children that my indignation melted into laughter. The very utterance of these words frightened the children nearly to death and made the mother tremble. At this juncture, learning that the general had taken matter in hand, I left.
There is no record regarding how or if this matter was resolved. Toward the end of the war, Governor Zebulon Vance reorganized the state militia, and an election was held for major of the Johnston County Battalion. Planter politician and avowed Unionist William A. Smith ran against Colonel Adam J. Heath, who had commanded the Home Guard since the war began. Smith told the men gathered in the courthouse square, "We did not make the war, and I, for one, want a good place to keep from the bullets." Smith won by a landslide, with Heath receiving 1 vote, his own. This incident illustrates how war-weary most people were by the time Dr. James Thomas Leach of Leechburg, presently Cleveland Township, decided to run for Confederate Congress in 1863. He was elected on a peace platform and vowed to bring an honorable end to the war as soon as possible. He and Smith were both branded traitors, but they persisted in their efforts to end the fighting and mass bloodshed that had brought so much misery and torment. In the end, it was military maneuvering rather than politicking that brought an end to the American Civil War. Charlie Powell and his comrades fought hard to halt the Union advance from Atlanta to his home state. William T. Sherman's army was not to be stopped. Powell was near Fayetteville when he received a 3-day leave to go home and warn his family and neighbors about the impending invasion of Union forces so they would have ample time to hide food and valuables. These silver spoons, for example, were unearthed many years later on the Lockhart Jones farm. Powell had a good time partying at night, though, with the ladies of his neighborhood and soon rejoined his company in western Johnston County. He remembered his colonel with a canteen full of hot stuff and endured a teasing by the boys for smelling like roses and Sweet Betsy's. Soon they were on the battlefield at Bentonville. Union Primitive Baptist Church near the Powell plantation was spared vandalism or destruction, reportedly because of its name. However, U.S. soldiers tore down the old Beulah Church near Kenly and used the materials to build a bridge across Little River. The church was rebuilt and in 1915 finally received $300 in reparations. The 50th North Carolina Regiment was called from Tarboro to Savannah to join General Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee in November 1864. According to Lieutenant Joseph C. Ellington, they fought hard and witnessed one tragic scene after another in South Carolina before General William Hardee led them to a crossroads near Elevation Methodist Church March 17, 1865. General Hardee was unsure whether Sherman would go to Raleigh or Goldsboro, so he positioned his troops so they could move in either direction. Lieutenant Ellington wrote that the next day they were called to Bentonville and camped at the Sneed Farm.
In the battle, 4 companies of the 50th Regiment, C and D of Johnston, E of Wayne, and H of Harnett, were near their homes. Many of the men who had not seen their homes and families for many months marched by them and tarried for only a few minutes. Then they went into the fight, the guns of which could be distinctly heard by their loved ones, and again, without stopping, marched by these same homes with Johnston's army on its final retreat, proving their faith and loyalty to the lost cause to the last.
Ellington's regiment had 900 men when they left Tarboro. By the end of the Bentonville battle, less than half remained. They had not slept under shelter since November. 13-year-old Mary Harper's home was in the middle of the battleground, but her parents, Amy, who's pictured here, and John Harper, refused to leave. After several hours of fighting, many wounded and dying Federal soldiers were brought there. These men were taken to Goldsboro after the battle, but many wounded Confederates still lay on the battlefield. As an adult, Mary Harper Hatcher recalled how they helped take care of the wounded and the dying.
My father offered his home as a hospital for them, and 54 heroes, some dying and some soon to die, were brought by their enemies to our hearts and hands. My mother and 2 sisters nursed them day and night, dressed their wounds, cooked for and fed them for 8 or 10 days before any nurses came. We sat by and saw them die, loving and comforting them as we would our own. The Federal Army furnished provisions for them, of course, from their supply, and we were saved from starvation. 23 of the 54 died, and we wrapped their blankets about them and laid them in the cold, cold ground.
Lieutenant Etheldred James Holt was one of 100 men remaining in his brigade of mounted cavalry at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, April 9, 1865. Decades later, he relived the events of that day.
The sun came up to our left, gloriously bright and warm and cheering to men worn out with cold, hunger, and loss of sleep as we were. About that time, a chaplain from some regiment in our division rode out in front of our brigade and made an earnest and fervent prayer. Soon afterwards, the enemy began shelling us. Promptly, General W.P. Roberts' brigade charged in line, with drawn sabers directly upon the battery. Our charge was first met by shells, then grape, and then by canister and the balls from the carbines. When we got within about 200 yards of them, they began to run. Some went into the woods, some took shelter under the gun carriages, and all quit firing. Our loss was very light. We captured 4 Napoleons and about 50 men.
As soon as they got prisoners and the captured guns to a secure location and reorganized, a small enemy force was spotted.
I called to General Roberts and pointed them out, and after a hasty examination with his field glass, he ordered the 75th to charge and capture them. We at once drew sabers and charged in columns of 4. Our Yankees dropped on their knees and opened on us with a hot fire with Spencer rifles. I saw it was impossible to reach them with the saber and gave the order to unsling carbines and fire. We gave them a volley, and about that time my horse was killed.
He soon ordered his men to fall back, and moments later, firing ceased as a party of Confederates came riding toward the courthouse with a flag of truce. General Robert E. Lee had made the agonizing choice to surrender his army. Roberts and others made their escape, and Holt, with no horse, was left in command.
We soon were camped in a field near the courthouse, where we made out a roll of men and officers present, drove our guns into the hard earth to tie our horses to, made a fire, burned our flag to keep the Yankees from getting it, and waited for further orders and something to eat. The next day we lay and rested. On Tuesday evening, we got our paroles ready and left for our homes in North Carolina.
The 53rd North Carolina Infantry Regiment was one of several units composed of Johnston County men who remained with General Lee when he surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia to U.S. General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865. Captain J.C. Richardson of Company C and many of his men had been captured at Fort Stedman near Petersburg on March 25th and were being held in Point Lookout Prison on the coast of Maryland. Jack, Richardson's body servant, had followed his master's remnant band of weary warriors to Appomattox. He and Needham, the slave of Lieutenant George T. Leach of Chatham County, delivered the news of the surrender to the company, as recalled by Leach's brother, Private John Leach.
They awoke me and gave me the first information I had of Lee's army, which I did not believe, until returning with them past the courthouse to the bivouac of the remnant of my company. I saw the open field about the village full of struggling men moving in aimless fashion, artillery, ambulances, and wagons gathering in parks, many men crying, some cursing, and all in pitiful distress.
Jack and Needham watched on April 10th as Leach and his men stacked their guns under the gaze of victorious Federal troops. Early the next morning, word of Lee's surrender reached U.S. General William T. Sherman, who was headquartered in the Johnston County Courthouse in Smithfield. Sherman quickly pursued Confederate General Joseph Johnston, who soon surrendered his forces at the Bennett Farm near Durham. This cruelest and bloodiest of wars was finally over. Lieutenant Joseph C. Ellington of the 50th North Carolina Regiment speculated if Lee and Johnston's armies had managed to unite, the outcome would have been different.
Would it have been for the best interest of our country and our race? While no true Confederate soldier has any apology to offer for his course, there is a wide diversity of opinion as to the correct answer to the above question.
That diversity of opinion existed among whites as well as African Americans in pro-Union places such as Johnston County. After the war, many local veterans groups were formed in the South, many becoming part of the United Confederate Veterans, which was formed in 1889. The first regular meeting of the UCV was held in 1890, and the final reunion was held in 1951. Descendants of Southern soldiers began an organization called Sons of Confederate Veterans in 1896, and they continue to hold meetings and are involved in activities to memorialize their Confederate ancestors. Johnston County's Confederate veterans got together each year following the war, such as this group on July 4, 1919, in Selma, North Carolina. John Harrison Parker was a young man when he enlisted in the Confederate Army and was promptly handed this bugle, which he didn't know how to play at the time, but quickly learned and became the regimental bugler. After the war, Parker brought the bugle with him to each reunion, even 54 years later at the 1919 reunion in Selma. Andrew Jackson Ellis enlisted in the North Carolina 2nd Junior Reserve Troops in 1864. He was a commander-in-chief of the North Carolina Veterans and was Johnston County's last living Confederate when he died in 1944 at the age of 97. On August 27, 2016, the Heritage Center of Johnston County hosted a reception honoring one of only 10 real daughters of the Confederacy in the United States. 93-year-old Iva Lee Benson Gainey of Benson is the daughter of Confederate veteran Charlie Benson. Speakers at the reception included Heritage Commission member John Booker of Smithfield and Patricia Gasson of Wilmington, president of the North Carolina Division, United Daughters of the Confederacy. Craig Braswell, portraying General Joseph E. Johnston, presented Mrs. Gainey with a framed certificate commemorating the event. Although this exhibit is drawn to a close, the Heritage Center has an ongoing commitment to preserving and presenting the history of the Civil War in Johnston County. Schools, libraries, and other museums desiring to borrow display panels from the exhibit for temporary exhibitions are encouraged to contact the center's director at heritagecenter@johnstonNC.com or by phone at 919-938-4708.
Take me back to the place where I first saw the light. To my sweet sunny South, take me home, where the mockingbird sang me to sleep in the night. Oh, why was I tempted to roam?